Maybe not.
All right, listen up, everyone. We're revisiting Edward Said, Orientalism, and every man in this village is a liar. Now, most of you are using Orientalism at a certain point. What the hell? No, Hamish, no. People need to be able to make notes. Okay, so a structural approach to the essay that I have taught you that you should be using.
Can we sit like in there or there or there?
Yeah, just move. Just going to wait. Okay, so in order to structure your essay on every man, this is one approach which you should be familiar with. So you take one paragraph and you make it about academic or theoretical, the theoretical text that we've been looking at. So Edward Said's text Orientalism is a great place to start in your first main body paragraph. I think it's always good to cover that before you move into a discussion of Stack. The journalistic is another great way to frame that opening paragraph, as opposed to just launching straight into a discussion of Megan Stack. So if you're looking at that, you could combine a paragraph on Orientalism with someone like Michael Ware. You could look at John Pilger at that point if you wanted to, and then revisit him when we come back down here to our local conflict paragraph. But certainly this paragraph as a setup point is useful in your essays on every man. Yeah.
Could you talk about all of them in one paragraph?
Yep. So academic and theoretical are kind of interchangeable. Certainly Edward Said was an academic and theorist. And, if you combine commentary on him and mention some of the journalists that you're going to talk about in that first essay, that's okay. It's like a mini introduction. So you do your big introduction, and then the second one could act as like a mini introduction. Yeah.
Do you almost incorporate Orientalism and the brief introduction of all the different journalists as an introduction?
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
That could be a way of structuring
Yep.
that.
Absolutely. So if you wanted to, in this first paragraph, you could be writing about Orientalism and a selection of journalists. You might look at Michael Ware, John Pilger, and Megan Stack, and mention them all in the light of Orientalism, and then have the other three paragraphs about each of them. Why not? So the second, this is, one framework, obviously. The second paragraph, you'd move into a discussion of Megan Stack and every man in this village. The third one, focus on a global conflict. Obviously, anything that's referenced in Stack's text you could use, but you have to make sure you move beyond what's simply in the text. For example, a discussion of Syria here would be really useful. So when you look at a global conflict, Syria, has been going on for years, but has been a hot topic recently because of the refugee crisis, or the escalating refugee crisis. Again, that's been a problem for years, but it's become very much part of the mainstream because of the images that have been coming out of that part of the world. Yep.
You talk about the Palestine and then go into Dr. Abalash.
Absolutely. So your global conflict paragraph, Matt, might be about Abalash, but you need to frame it more broadly. Don't just jump straight into a discussion of Dr. Abalash. Talk about Palestine, talk about Israel, and talk about the conflict, and then use him as an example.
The continued escalation of conflict in Gaza Strip.
Yep.
Is it alright if is global conflict, if that sort of comes in within your stack sort of paragraph?
Yeah. I think for you, Sarah, I think what you're doing, you need to keep doing. Just make sure you're answering particular.
Okay.
Make sure you're focused on prompts.
Yeah.
That's what you need to do. But in terms of a structure, if you're still not settled on a particular structural approach, this is a really good one and is flexible for lots of different examples. It'll just give you an anchor. So when you go into the exam, you can go, okay, my theory paragraph is going to be on this. My textual paragraph, I'm going to focus on, whatever particular chapter you're looking at. The global conflict I'm going to use for this prompt is going to be Syria, the crisis in Syria. And then the local conflict, as you know, I think the local conflict that I think is worthwhile visiting is the Northern Territory intervention. So the occupation of land. Your thread becomes with regard to this is Orientalism and othering. So the notion of power, the notion of truth, and the notion of fear all fit under the umbrella of Orientalism. So you can talk about lots of different prompts using Orientalism as a thread. How would you look at fear as a part of a discussion for Orientalism?
Fear of the
If you had a prompt, for example, on fear, what would you do? Yep.
xenophobia and fear of the unknown.
Yeah, and what about it?
Fear of the unknown. How it contributes to cultural misconceptions.
Yeah, I think you can talk about how it contributes to cultural misconceptions and
Okay.
conflict,
I
but it's
think-
also a result.
Yeah, I'd say that Orientalism
Both. It's
is
both.
the catalyst for the
Yeah.
fear we have.
So you need to be able to look at both, though. You need to be able to look at it as a catalyst of conflict and also as something that is born from conflict. So yes, it's culture. We make cultural assumptions, but they're based on some of the things that we've learnt throughout history
Yeah.
as a part of conflict. Yeah, and those are generalisations, but they're generalisations that have emerged through times of conflict.
Mhm.
Yep. As I said, the local one here, if you're looking at journalism, you could talk about John Pilger and his coverage of the Indigenous crises in remote communities in Utopia. You could also talk about what's happening in Western Australia right now, which is Indigenous people being removed from remote communities in Western Australia. Scott Ludlam is a really excellent speechwriter and senator, politician who you could quote in an essay on local conflict. Really worth looking at some of the things he said and some of the things he's written. So again, your local conflict I think is good because bringing in a local conflict is going to make your essay on Everyman stand apart from a lot of other essays because the focus is obviously going to be on the Middle East for the great majority of these essays, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. You going to say something?
No.
Okay. Any questions? Okay. So these are some of the potential threads that could emerge if we use that structure. Okay. So when you're thinking about the various wars that are going on over there and bringing it into a local context, so the idea of occupation and colonialism, all of these ideas could come through depending on what you're writing about. So the notion of truth and lies, I think Stack talks about that. Stack talks about the myth of what America has done as perceived internationally and especially in America. So, the occupation of parts of the Middle East by the US, there are multiple versions of what's actually going on there. Yeah.
In a way of following the same thread for the Middle East and that kind of thing, instead of, say, going for the Aboriginal examples, would you possibly be able to go for the far-right groups or against Islam and that kind of thing?
What do you mean?
Protests in Bendigo.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Reclaim Australia? Excellent.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like
Yep. For your local conflict? Absolutely. Team Australia.
Reclaim Australia has a merchandise.
The asylum seeker crisis, all of these things, they're happening now and they're happening here. So I think if you can make the connect, you need to be able to make the connections though between what's happening here.
Yeah.
Well, it might be easy for you, but it's, you need to make those explicit as well, Hamish, because I think sometimes in your mind they're explicit, but it doesn't come through in your writing. And I know your knowledge is, extensive, but you need to make sure that what's up here translates on the page, yeah?
Is it like inappropriate to try and not reference everything in that last paragraph as in that local conflict? But could you bring it up in kind of in mentioning it? Have a focus on possibly the intervention and stuff, and then mention the asylum seeker and the Team Australia kind of stuff, and saying this is like more broadly as opposed to going into depth about each individual one? Or would you?
What you don't want to do is have this huge umbrella of examples that you just skim across. So what you need to do is have most of the paragraph needs to have an in-depth touch point or a touchstone, if that makes sense. So make sure you don't just say, and then there's this, and then there's this. Don't make it a list.
Yeah.
And the examples that you use need to intersect as well. There needs to be connection and transition between examples. Some of you are doing this thing where you'll have an example and then the other example is related, but you don't spell it out. So you have an example and then you bring in another one without any transition between the two. The nuanced writing comes in between the examples. So how you actually parallel your next example or contrast your next example with the previous thing is what's important. That is what brings the sophistication to your essays. So obviously journalism will provide a thread. Breaking things up into bystanders and perpetrators is another really good way of looking at how you're going to attack different prompts. So if you look at an essay prompt and you think, I've got no idea how to handle this, think about how bystanders and perpetrators and victims fall in. So think about that sort of triangle and okay, in terms of this question, for example, you might have fear. One of the prompts we used earlier, fear is the seed from which conflict grows. You think about where bystanders, perpetrators and victims sit in terms of that. Bystanders would be a really interesting one for discussion in terms of that, in terms of fear. So if you ask yourself the question, where do bystanders, perpetrators and victims sit within this prompt? That'll give you some material to work with and a potential plan as well. And if you go back to the previous slide, if you're thinking about all of this stuff in terms of those three things, that provides you with a thread: bystanders, perpetrators, victims. Colonialism and Orientalism, obviously some of you are writing really well on that, and I would encourage you to use that as your thread. If you still don't get, if your head's still not around it and you can't apply the theory to lots of different things, just use it in one paragraph. Don't make it your entire thread. Values and ideology. These two things are connected. Colonialism and Orientalism and values and ideology are connected, but I guess I'm thinking more about sort of, it becomes more political in the second last dot point there. And the last one, not many of you have done this. I had a few students attempt this last year, and if you still want to have a go at it, by all means do it. Linking your essay on conflict with a thread of, writers, artists, photographers, cartoonists would be a really interesting angle as well. So if you're still a bit lost on how you're approaching conflict, and I imagine some of you will feel a bit lost after your practice exam and that you have to have a fresh approach, that's a really great way of doing it. You could look at cartoonists and how they've handled various conflicts in the Middle East and internationally and here in Australia and do that really well. The recent Syrian refugee crisis, where there was that photo published of Aylan Kurdi, makes a really good connection with Kevin Carter. There's a great New York Times article that I put on Padlet that is called The Boy on the Beach, and it talks about the connections, the journalistic connections as from a photographer's point of view of taking that picture of that dead boy on the beach and the uprising and the subsequent kind of political movement that occurred because of the publication of that photo. Again, there were lots of adaptations of that photo. Lots of artists and cartoonists reappropriated that image to make political statements as well. Sorry? The photographer? I think it was a man, yeah. Probably. But again, it's if you think about Kevin Carter, and if you're constantly thinking back to Stack, she's our writer in this sort of pyramid, that there is a conflict there in terms of, that this child is an individual, and yet the story should go public in order for there to be awareness about what's really going on. So that, I had a really interesting discussion with my husband about the fact that I got my literature class to respond to that image through poetry. He thought it was a terrible idea, but I thought it was really important. Some of them hadn't even seen that picture, despite the fact that it had gone so viral. No, so I think it was really important for them to see it and to respond creatively to it and think about it. But he was arguing that this is a child, this is a person, this is an individual, not some symbol for everyone's humanitarian, Do you know what I'm saying? So the idea that interpretations of these events, whether it be through art, photography, cartoonists, whatever,
It's
texts.
It's like the anguish of the journalist.
Sorry, what were you saying, Kyle? Just thinking out loud? What, Sarah?
I was saying that that's the constant anguish of a journalist and a photographer and like that.
Yeah, or not. For some journalists, it wouldn't be.
Yeah, true. But even in the moment, like for instance, Kevin Carter, like probably at the time was like, oh, this is the right thing to do. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
Is
We
it
can't
more?
know. But it's like,
Certainly in subsequent interviews, as he was doing it, it was a problem
what
for him.
about where? And because I mean, sorry,
No.
Stack, where, Carter.
Well, and where would be the filmmaker
And
here
the person
as well?
who took the photo of the Syrian boy, they've all had that in common, like.
Yep.
You know, things in
So
common
Michael
experience.
Ware, what do we know about Michael Ware and his? Yeah. So he filmed someone die very slowly when he could have actually helped that person. So it's not, I guess the difference between the photographer of Aylan Kurdi is that he was already dead.
Yeah.
But the idea of what's public and private, I think, is part of that inner conflict. Anyway, let's move on. What I'm putting up here, though, is I guess what I want you to do is look at these prompts, think about your material, and ask yourself, can I create a link out of these things? So the questions that arise when you look at your prompt should be based around not only your material, but these ideas. What threads can I build in my essay? And that should be very prompt specific. You might have a really good idea of what you want to say, but you have to make sure that it's tightly connected to the prompt. Okay, I'm going to skip that. If you want to reread the model essay that I put up on Padlet, go for it. That's the one where I refer to where the wild things are. It's quite a good. It's a demonstration of how you put an Orientalist lens on a text. Okay, so if you want to think how does it work? How do you put a particular lens on a particular text? That's an example. So I'd go back and have a look at that. Okay, so if you are using colonialism, Orientalism, or ideology as a thread, that's my example from before as well. Again, using Edward Said, then Megan Stack, Israel and Palestine as an example, Australia's secret wars, or the wars we don't talk about here at home. I like that as a connection, this idea that we're all very caught up in what's going on overseas, but we've actually got this quite immense cultural conflict going on here. I'm going to stop there. What I would suggest, don't move. What I would suggest you do is, if you're doing Every Man, is finish off that PowerPoint. Yeah. And you can revisit. Who was that? Oh, that's all right then. She's allowed to leave.